Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
I'm going off the grid.
Coming on Zoom is a very weird way to do that. Why would you want to do that? Why? What's the
What
reason?
is... uh, why wouldn't I want to do that? I
Okay,
mean, a year
fair.
ago, I was getting radiation treatments for prostate cancer.
I definitely
And
don't recommend going off the grid during
okay,
that.
they're over. Well, and so I am getting divorced. Plus, I don't want to spend the next 3.5 years or more listening to stories about Donald Trump. Do you know what happens? Never happens in a Donald Trump story. Surprise.
You weren't surprised by the Elon split.
I was not surprised. Nobody was surprised by that. I mean, it was funny, but not surprising, not interesting. I don't think I would have missed anything by skipping it any more than I missed, Trump suggesting that we inject disinfectants into COVID patients in 2020. I could have done without that, it turns out, in the end.
Okay, I could also have done without that. But come on, you have people who you love and care about in your life, starting with your two amazing sons. You don't think they would be affected if you just vanished?
They would be. And I would never leave them or you or any of the other people I'm lucky enough to have in my life. But the enticement in these times of just bailing on our crazy politics, our fractured communities, our tech oligarch future, and going back to nature is as real as it was in Thoreau's day. And it's the premise behind Jess Walter's excellent new novel, So Far Gone.
Jess Walter is the award-winning, best-selling author of 8 novels, 2 books of short stories, and 1 nonfiction book. He was a finalist for the National Book Award in 2006 for The Zero and won the 2005 Edgar Allan Poe Award for Citizen Vince. His novel Beautiful Ruins was a #1 New York Times bestseller and spent more than a year on the bestseller list. The Financial Lives of the Poets was Time Magazine's #2 novel of the year, and Walter's story collection, We Live in Water, was on Barack Obama's Best Books of 2019 list. His stories, essays, criticism, and journalism have appeared in Harper's, Esquire, Playboy, McSweeney's, Tin House, Plowshares, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and many, many others. And we're delighted to have him back on the show. Welcome back, Jess.
Oh, thanks. Great to be back. And Whitney, if you really are serious about that, I do have some land up north that no electricity, nothing. So
Okay, well,
it's harder to go off the grid than you think. But it's
send
all
me
yours.
a printed letter about it because I don't,
All right.
I don't want it on the internet anywhere. I don't want
Yeah.
to let overseers to see where this is.
Good,
Map
good
it out.
move. Yeah.
So, Jess, there are many voices in your new novel, So Far Gone. We'll get to that as we go on. But the first and arguably most central voice is Rhys Kinnick. And how about if you could just tell us a little bit about him to start us off?
Yeah, Rhys sort of came out of the idea you guys were talking about for me, which I had seen this New Yorker cartoon of a car racing along the freeway, and ahead of it said, "Can't look away." And then there was this little off-ramp that said, "Had enough." And I'm such a news hound, and I mean, I was crunching data all through 2024, looking at the precinct level, watching politics. And at some point, I just got so fed up with it that I thought, what would happen if you just threw your cell phone, your smartphone out the window the way Rhys does, watched it bounce in the median, and then went off the grid and stepped away from it all. And Rhys is a former environmental reporter for a local newspaper. I was a newspaper reporter for about 7 years, and still think of myself in many ways almost as a spot news novelist. So still drawn to write stories as they're happening. And so it was very easy at first for me to sort of inhabit this character, Rhys, and then fill him with the sort of rant that I find myself um, uh, uh, perpetrating in my own head all the time. And then, as always happens with fictional characters, the political becomes personal, and you start knowing much more about this sort of cranky old guy who has moved up to the woods and spent the last 7 years doing nothing but reading books and writing an incredibly ambitious book called the Atlas of Wisdom that he thinks is going to be his lasting, the thing that people remember him by.
I mean, that kind of does sound like what I've been doing for the last 7 years, just not in the woods, I guess. Or every writer in some ways.
Yeah.
Anyway, Sugi and I were talking about in the opening, like families matter,
Yeah.
especially if you're thinking about going off the grid. And as the book opens with Reese in his cabin, discovering that his grandchildren, Leah and Ash, are at his door. So just to give us a sort of shape of the book, so as we talk about its issues, just like how did they get there? And who are the
Yeah.
other important members of Reese's family for our listeners?
Yeah, that was the first image I had, was this guy living in the woods and two kids showing up on his porch, and I needed something that would shock him out of his paralysis, out of the fact that he has dropped out of the world. And I'm a probably over attentive father, and so sometimes you'll create a character out of pieces of yourself or something you've thought, or even a career, and then when they depart from you is when it's most interesting. So imagining that Reese has only seen his grandkids once in the last 7 years, and he doesn't recognize them when they show up on his porch. So the book begins right there. He looks out on the porch, sees two kids, and asks if they're selling magazines or chocolate bars for their school, and of course they're neither. They're his grandchildren, and from there, it seemed like a really straight path to him having to recover his family. And I think all of us have checked out in some way, but I wanted to write a sort of heightened version of that checking out, and then thinking what would draw me back. And the thing that would, I think, that draws any of us back is family. And he's what has estranged him from his family is that he's punched his son-in-law, a guy named Shane, who has sort of followed AM talk radio all the way to its illogical conclusion, which is the sort of Christian nationalism that we find all over the country now. And so he belongs to this church, the Church of the Blessed Fire, which has a men's group called the Army of the Lord, which Reese keeps mistaking for his old email address, AOL. And that sort of is what starts the thing going. And then his daughter Bethany has disappeared, and a friend has brought the grandkids to Reese, and that's one of the reasons he didn't recognize them, is they're with a different woman. But yeah, that's sort of what gets the action going, and really what drives it is Reese trying to find out where his daughter's gone, why these suddenly abandoned children are on his porch, and to deal with the thing he left behind when he punched his son-in-law at Thanksgiving in 2016, which is the fissure in this family that may be irreparable.
It's interesting. I was thinking as I was reading this book about all of the children's books where the children are like by themselves, as is really helpful sometimes in children's literature, and then they find the grandparent, like the Boxcar Children or Dicey Song. And I never really thought about like what is it like on the other end when your grandchildren show up. And you mentioned the figure of Shane, who is as you, like, a white nationalist who thinks that the NFL is being rigged by globalists. It's very hard to write about people like Shane.
Is the NFL not being rigged by globalists? Is this something?
Oh my God.
I thought I
We're
understood
breaking it
this
to
to
Whitney
be
right now.
everyone who's not a Chiefs fan certainly thinks that. I believe that the Chiefs win on pure talent, but I've heard some other people thinking differently.
I mean, if that's the case, then they've only done football, because I think the Royals are still on the other side of the grand conspiracy.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, it's hard to write about people like Shane, who believe in such improbable concepts, and yet they're like totally adamant about and committed to their in air quotes on this truth. So how do you make a character like that three-dimensional? How did you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I can't. I guess one of the big problems for me is that we almost can't imagine what people on the far other side of the spectrum think. And as novelists, if we can't imagine it, that feels like a defeat. That feels like surrendering in some way. My career sort of began, my writing career, writing about people on the far right and the fringe. There's a moment in this book where Reese finds his old editor and says, "Who's covering the radical right now?" And his editor says, "The government reporter." These ideas that when I wrote about them in 1992 about Ruby Ridge were on the fringe are so much in the mainstream. And I think the biggest reason why has to do with Reese's old career. Reese was a journalist, and we have eroded every establishment, every source of knowledge and information. Trust has been eroded in it. Not, and the media is just one of them. Now, half or more of Americans get their news from social media. And of course, they're not really getting news. They're getting conspiracy theories. They're getting reinforcement of what they already believe. But to write about a character like Shane, I think, is no longer to write about a fringe character. 1/5 of Americans believe that the COVID vaccine implanted microchips in your body. The same number believe that the US government was behind 9/11. These are conspiracies that drift back and forth from far right to far left. One of the things that sparked the novel was having some reasonable friends tell me that the NFL was rigged in this conspiratorial way.
Again, I just want to point out it's not.
It was not
very
Whitney.
good.
It was not Whitney. I will say that. He although when the Chiefs run is over, you can get back with me.
People felt that because Kelsey did a Pfizer commercial, right? Those things matter to people.
Yeah,
really?
And so we live in very conspiratorial times, and the scariest thing is 40% of Americans believe that no matter who's in charge of the government, there's really a secret cabal of shadowy forces running. The effort to undermine our institutions has been so successful, and to me, I never thought it would reach schools and libraries, but these things are under attack too. And so what comes in its place is a fractured, poorly educated, conspiratorial world, and Shane belongs to it. And as a fiction writer, I knew I was writing toward that point as I sort of explored each point of view, and I wondered what I would find when I got there. And as with all characters, you just do your best to understand what could be motivating it. And I think, in a weird way, the same thing that motivates Reese is motivating Shane, and that's a fear and a disgust with the state of the world. And how wild that the people that we feel the most distanced from, I think, in some ways are motivated by some of the same emotions, if none of the same information, none of the same empirical reality.
So, as you mentioned, the book isn't just told from Reese's point of view, but we get the thoughts of a number of other characters. We get Leah and Asher, the grandchildren. Those sections are fascinating. And they've been living this like very strict, kind of cloistered life in Shane's religious world. And I appreciated the way that you tried, kind of without judgment, to imagine how they would imagine and think about, their grandfather, who to them is a non-believer. So could you talk a little bit about how you wrote those sections and then read us a passage from Asher's point of view?
Yeah. Those were in many ways my favorite characters to write. For a while, I lived on the very land that I describe here, in the most remote part of Washington State, and we still owned that piece of land. And the different kinds of kids you would run into. I have some very extreme religious people in my family, and every time I talk to the kids, I'm amazed at their level of intellect, their level of engagement with the world, how much they innately understand. And I think, I came from a family that was not, I'm a first generation college student, and yet sometimes there's this desire to understand the world that I think can't be closed off. And so, Asher is one of my favorite kind of characters to write, because he's in many ways might be the only autobiographical character in the book, because he's a wannabe prodigy, and I have spent my whole life wanting to be a prodigy and coming up short in every way. And so those were great characters to write, and to imagine that while their family's church is stifling in some ways, that every kid, I think, has inside them this this endless well of curiosity and creativity, and it might be my over hopeful nature. But yeah, I'll read a little bit of Asher's point of view here now. This is early on when when Asher and his sister Leah have just arrived at their grandfather's house. And he's talking about his dad, Shane. Asher knew that his father's beliefs upset people, like thinking they needed to move to the mountain redoubt to prepare for the coming holy war, and that God had commanded Shane to be master of his wife, and that Shane should not spare the rod to his children, and that the earth might be flat, and that chess came from the Arabs or from a secret satanic society. But the rest of the family just let him talk, and it mostly didn't affect them. And his dad didn't seem to mind that they believed other things. He didn't say anything when Asher read books about dinosaurs or when he made a book report saying volcanoes were millions of years old. And a lot of what Shane talked about, he didn't even do, like not sparing the rod. He'd never hit Asher. Some of the other kids from Bible study got hit a lot, but his dad hardly ever even spanked him. Only one time that Asher could remember, when Asher was interrupting, and it wasn't even very hard, more like a swat, so that Shane could tell the other guys at church that he'd done it. But none of that was what Asher was worried about. The thing Asher worried about was the sort of trouble they'd had last year in Grants Pass, when his dad got upset that they were teaching about sex in Leah's science and health class, and he made a big fuss at school and tried to pray in her classroom. And the teacher said she felt threatened, and after that, they'd had to get homeschooled. Asher didn't like homeschool as much as he liked school. They watched Mrs. Gaines' car disappear through the stand of spotted white birches. Those trees looked like the legs of tall, skinny Dalmatians, Leah said. It was true, Asher thought. His sister really did have a way of describing things. They listened to the sound of Mrs. Gaines's car engine accelerate onto the dirt road beyond, fading toward the highway. The rain had stopped, and beams of sunlight appeared on the misty droplets of low lingering clouds. They all turned to face each other, Asher and Leah and their grandfather. I wonder, Asher said, if you might have a chessboard. I don't. I'm sorry, Reese said. No one to play up here. I play games by myself sometimes. I've heard people do that, Reese said. Asher nodded. I usually open with the Ruy Lopez or the Sicilian defense. I can only play a few moves in my mind. After 4 or 5, I either need to get a board or pen and paper to keep track. I'm not very good at notation. Eventually, I'll be able to play entire games in my mind, though. All the best players can.
Thank you very much. So I thought a couple of things about that passage, just thinking from a writer's point of view. I think it's really interesting to we get the kids and Bethany's views on Shane at different points in the book. And all of them say, like Bethany at a later point in the book says, he was a good man. He had a good heart, and like, it's important to have the testimony of the family. And I think it's also one thing that I was thinking about that part is like Asher views his father's belief system as just a part of who he is, right? It's like, okay, my dad smokes cigars and people don't like it, but he also, is good at playing baseball or whatever. You're like, okay, my dad, thinks that the world was created in 8 days or whatever. And that's a part of who he is, but not the whole thing. Whereas I think people on the left, or people who are not religious view that as like, once you say that, that's your entire identity. You have no other identity that could be contemplated, and I thought that was really important. I wonder if you could talk about like that approach, like, and then also him saying like a lot of what Shane talked about, he didn't do. So knowing that it's not all true,
Yeah, I think there are a few things that were at work for me. One, I had a character, Bethany, who was very bright, and I also needed to explain why she would stay with this guy, But we're also meeting him sort of, all of these characters are really at points in their lives when everything is at its extreme. Bethany's mother has died, and suddenly she is looking at her life in a very different way. Shane wasn't always like this. Early on, they go to a much more mainstream church. It's one of those big box churches that they nickname Godsko, which is maybe my favorite word in the book. But like a lot of people, it's a sort of pathway where it has to keep increasing in intensity. And understanding that was Shane's kind of character, that he was looking for an explanation for the world. I think he's in danger of becoming more of that kind of character. But I completely agree with you that none of us are one thing. And you said people on the left look at people on the right that way. Obviously, the same thing happens to people on the right. We are, I'm sure there's someone who imagines that I walk around in a cloud of wokeness, demanding everyone use they as a pronoun or something, And so we are more than just the box that the button that we punch when we vote, and we're also more than whatever religion we happen to practice or don't practice in my case. And so it was important to me to have the kids see their father as a father. I mean, ask yourself, did you agree with everything your parents believed, even at 8 or 9 or 12 or 13? We start to make our individual choices pretty early on, and especially when your father has moved in that direction and maybe the rest of the family hasn't. And so it was both the point of the lives they were at, and I think you're right, a larger point about human nature and the complexity of hopefully all of it.
Well, my dad was very religious, and so I did, I think, compartmentalize. Uh, like what I mostly didn't want him to do was be super religious around my friends because that was embarrassing. But
Right.
in and of itself, him praying around the house when people weren't around, I'm like, all right, fine, whatever. That's your thing, Pop. You know, you do
Yeah.
it, you know. And so like I responded to those parts of Asher and Leah and the way that they're thinking about.
Yeah.
Um,
I think they also come from the faith I have, which is a faith of books, of language. I mean,
yeah.
their mom has fed them books, and I don't know that I could have created young characters that wise and self-aware, if they also hadn't had a library growing up. And they've just culled their books of everything that the church didn't agree with, which is another, I think, including their grandfather's one book, a work of ecological nonfiction essays, and his daughter says a really cutting thing because Reese's daughter Bethany is estranged from him, and she says she tells her daughter that essays are books written by people who care more about ideas than they do people. Which is such a cutting thing for her to
Brutal.
say about her father. But she comes from, I mean, her pride in her father as an author, and I think a lot of times that those people whose lives are made of choices, between this college or that college, forget that for many people that isn't the choice. And writing Bethany, I thought a lot about my mom, who was brilliant and who never would have had a chance to go to college or to have a career, and yet her brilliance was a kind of innate thing that just came out of her.
So you're talking about, you mentioned earlier, just sort of like, yeah, Bethany is this smart character, and um, Leah, who is also so self-aware. And one of the things that really conveys this in the book is like Leah's language, actually, in particular, right? She has all these amazing descriptions. There's a line about like trees looking like the legs of tall, skinny Dalmatians, just as one example. There's like a little bit of maybe like a nature versus nurture conversation here. So Leah's growing up in a homeschooled Christian environment that privileges conformity over originality. And then she has this language that's so original. How did you end up developing that?
Yeah, when I was a kid, we started a magazine in our family called Reader's Indigestion. It was like Reader's Digest, but and I was the 8-year-old editor, and my siblings would write stories, and my cousins would write stories, and I had one cousin, Natalie, who would write a beauty column, and she always spelled beauty Betty. So she would write the Betty column, and which we became her name, Betty the beauty columnist, once she could spell better. And that was our fun. We would write a magazine. And so it doesn't, these kids haven't been homeschooled their whole lives. They were in school until about 8 months, a year ago. And so I do think that they had, some good teachers along the way, but I do believe in that innate power. I volunteer at a tutoring program here, and when you pull that pull start on a kid, it's incredible the stories and observations that come out. And the first thing that I started thinking about Leah was that she was one of those more visual thinkers, and so she describes her descriptions of colors were so fun. She her grandfather's hair and beard, I think she described as biscuits and gravy or something like that. This sort of grayish, white, brownish, dirty mess, and that
Well, there
was
was
just
like
so
twice
fun.
plowed snow or something like
Yeah,
that. That was
right.
that
Yeah,
what
and
I'm remembering. Okay, I like that.
yeah, and I just thought, it was so. I was constantly surprised by my kids, and constantly surprised when I tutor and teach. and in some ways, I wondered if a character like Bethany didn't have a bit of an advantage because she's grown up in a world of books and not electronics. Her parents have not let her have a phone, you may have noticed. And so, in a way, she's a bit of a throwback. And I worry more about, I honestly worry more about kids whose attention spans have been fractured by watching 15-second TikTok videos than I maybe do about homeschooled kids, because depending on the home, while I'm a public education guy from as deep as you can go in my bones, I also think that that electronics in many ways are as big a threat as the kind of indoctrination that maybe a family like this could have.
I feel like there's been, in the last few episodes we've done, there's been this sort of uniting principle. We talked to Charlie Baxter about his new book, which also has a right-wing character in it. And then we talked to Julia Elliott about why Democrats can't get any votes in rural areas, which is an episode that I insist we do every 6 months or so. And
Yeah.
her main thing was like, the Democrats have to just stop. What I see on Twitter all the time, and I'm sure that you do if you go there yourself, is like just people saying that anyone who's MAGA is stupid and just doing stupid jokes over and over again, rhyming MAGA, making the M stand for moron, and then doing some sort of post that has, like over and over and over again, and that is not gonna work, and the idea is like also that like what you're trying to do here, and I feel like writers are starting to try to do, is try to figure out who people are, and to sort of get behind that original instinct of like pushing away, because as you said, like this is a significant part of our population now. Like this, you can't not write about this particular part of the world. Your first book, Every Knee Shall Bow, was about the standoff and shootout at Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho, the same area where Shane, Bethany, Leah, and Asher live in a campground called the Redoubt, which you talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
How has the situation with anti-government far-right groups in Washington State, Oregon, and Idaho changed since you reported on Ruby Ridge in 1992?
What does Joyce say about snow in Dublin, that it's general across the country? I think this. I mean, I think we all have seen. I remember those signs at Ruby Ridge in 1992 and having to look up what some of them meant, and now they are part of the mainstream political life in America.
I also feel like I want to interrupt you just to tell everyone who may not remember what happened at Ruby Ridge. What did happen at Ruby Ridge?
Yeah. So Ruby Ridge was an 11-day standoff between a white separatist family and the federal government that ended in 3 deaths: the death of a U.S. Marshal, Randy Weaver's 14-year-old son, and his wife, who was holding their baby in their rural, remote cabin. Much like the people in this book, they had gone off the grid. Weaver wasn't really a criminal like the Order or any of those groups, but the federal government saw him as a potential informant, and so got him to saw the barrels off some shotguns, which was illegal. Later, a jury ruled that was entrapment. He became a fugitive, and then the marshals surrounded his house. There was a shootout, an 11-day standoff. It was bedlam, and it was really a civil rights violation, but on the far right side. I think at the time I was used to covering those on the left, but I came away with that believing in complexity in storytelling, complexity in people. You can't, and a lot of people took that as sort of the evidence that the government was out to get you, and started a lot of politicians began sort of climbing on that. And Reagan, of course, said the government was wasteful, and he campaigned against government to run the government, like that kid who runs for student council promising to abolish it. But this was a step up. This was saying the government will come after you and harm you in a way. And it really struck a chord in those rural places we're talking about, because they felt so distanced from, whatever wealth was coming in the United States, or they felt distanced from where the culture was going. So Ruby Ridge continued to sort of hum in this way, and and in the Northwest, it's interesting because I think the rest of the country has found out what, some of these far right beliefs entail. I think in the West, Washington was the one state that got bluer in 2024. And so even though I live in a place that is sort of a borderland, the city I live in is very progressive. The outside county tends to vote Republican. I think Washington and Oregon and California remain a sort of parentheses of progressivism, while much of the rest of the country really drifted to the right in 2024.
So the Southern Poverty Law Center publishes something called a hate map, which lists hate groups around the country, including some of the states we're talking about. And the designations say things like anti-LGBTQ, anti-Muslim, anti-government general hate is a category. Sovereign citizens movement, white nationalist. These are all serious issues, even if I'm like a little bit amused by the term general hate. And as we were talking about before, like Asher says, a lot of what Shane talked about, he didn't do. But isn't talking about this stuff like also dangerous, or is the SPLC over dramatizing the danger of these groups?
Of course, I think these ideas are a kind of poison almost. But this is what happened at Ruby Ridge: is the family really never went beyond the ideas, and yet was the target of federal action. And so I think maybe it's because I'm a journalist, but I am a free speech a free speech purist, and I don't think the ideas themselves. I mean, I think the best way to defeat those ideas is to expose them to the light, not to try to ban them or keep them away in any way. I write about these characters because they are part of the world, and I try to understand them because I don't know any other way to write fiction, any other way to write characters. But I was also careful in the book. Shane, I think, is a more uh, sympathetic character, but he has a buddy named Dean who is known as the Dominion Eagle Killer, because he's been poaching eagles on Indian reservations and selling them, which is actually a business. It actually happens. And his defense in court was dominion over animals. So Reese has written a story about him and nicknamed him the Dominion Eagle Killer. And that is not a character that whose point of view I go into. And if I did, I don't think even Dean wakes up in the morning twirling his villain mustache and thinks, now I'll go about doing terrible things. Most people are driven by what they think of as their rights, or their way in the world. And I don't think we get anywhere as a culture by writing off people who have beliefs we don't agree with. If listening to them, understanding them, exposing them, doesn't lead them to change their beliefs, it at least makes us understand, what's causing people to go into these groups and to join these things. We are at a period of general hate, and I don't know if you know the James Baldwin quote. I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they'll be forced to deal with pain. And I think that is the truth in a lot of ways. And again, I think Reese at the beginning of the book sort of hates his son-in-law, and I think we find as we go through the novel that what he's really not dealing with is kind of his own failures as a parent, and his failure to adjust to a world that's changed out from under him.
Speaking of that kind of change, I started having a very weird experience while reading this book, which is that I'm identifying with Reese, right? I'm like, okay, this is the guy that represents the worldview of most of the world. This is our protagonist who's going to tell us about all these crazy people up here in Idaho, and But I started to wonder, like, how many people would read the book the way that I am reading it? Like if books like this about the far right usually like are aimed at the majority public who are uneducated about the far right, would disagree with their ideas, but like are those people even we're the minority now reading these books or even writing them? I felt this weird sensation like we had become what used to be the whole perspective had switched, right? Like that like
Yeah.
Reese was the weird guy. He is the weirdo in this book.
Right. Yeah, he is the weirdo. I mean, just to live in a world of books alone isolates you from a great part of the population. I was listening to an interview with an educator who said he used to have his students read Romeo and Juliet, and then they wouldn't read it. So then he would have them watch the Baz Luhrmann movie, and then have them read it, and they wouldn't read it. And then he would have them watch the Baz Luhrmann movie, and he would give them some excerpts, and that seemed to work for a while. And he said the last few times he's tried to show the Baz Luhrmann movie, they don't have the attention span to watch a 2-hour movie. They've been watching 15-second TikTok, and and so I do think the attention span that it takes to understand an incredibly complex world is something that is really in danger. And I'm an eternal optimist about people. I'm a humanist probably at my core, even though I it's hard to square that with environmental concerns. But I do think that get people together and get them to reason together, and we can often find solutions. And maybe Steven Pinker has gotten too far into my head. I'm too hopeful in some way. But I think the general idea that Reese comes to come out and try to resurrect his family and redeem himself in his daughter's eyes is the first step, and so I don't think that I think there are some things about Reese that make him the minority that maybe have always made him the minority. Maybe we like to imagine that it was a more educated populace before, but the attacks to public education, the fracturing of our attention. I do think there are some forces at work in the United States and the whole world. Honestly, the rise of nationalism and jingoism, and the blaming of immigrants and of for problems. I mean, there are some incredible problems that I think that we face that are much worse than they were years ago. I still think at most humans at their core are capable of kindness and decency, and it's where is for me the process of writing this book was to come out of my own sort of metaphoric woods, and I had stopped paying attention. I had gotten cynical, and at some point, to fight for a better world, you have to turn your back on that sort of cynicism, I think. And so in a way, the process of writing the book was reminding myself that I want to do what I can to make a better world, for my kids, for the kids I tutor, even for me in my last years. And so I think, yeah, I think as rare as the reading and thinking and caring population might be, as small, if it's shrinking in size, then we have to work twice as hard, maybe.
Well, it's very important for you to bring that optimistic message, especially to my co-host who has a very pessimistic person. We'll have to have a cool down session after this. But Jess, thanks so much for joining us yet again. We encourage listeners to pick up So Far Gone, as well as Jess's other fantastic books at your local independent bookstore.
Thanks, guys. So great seeing you again.
Thanks for being here.